Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with another nonfiction November video and another in my series where I am recommending some favorite nonfiction books based on my favorite historical figures. So as you can tell from the title of today's video, we are talking about Napoleon. This is very timely because I think I am posting this the day before the new Napoleon movie by Ridley Scott comes out. I am so excited. I am apprehensive, yet very excited. Some of you may recall that in 2021, I think it was, I did a year of Napoleon. That was kind of my reading project that year. I had been reading a biography of Napoleon and I did not realize how much of a bookworm and how much of a nerd he was. And so that entire year I themed around reading Napoleon's favorite books, but also reading nonfiction that discussed Napoleon. I kind of read things that were adjacent to Napoleon. And so I had a really great time in 2021. And I kind of developed a relationship with Napoleon that is very different to all expectations. I got into Napoleon in a very roundabout way, and I feel like I always thought I would never really be interested in him as a figure. And I remember a few years ago, I went to France. I actually went to Brittany, but I spent 1 week in Paris, which was really exciting. It was a really long length of time. And in the Louvre, I went to kind of the crown jewel section. There's not a lot remaining, of course, but one thing that's there is the pink diamond of Brittany, and I was kind of on a Brittany kick, and so that's really what I wanted to see. But in that same area, you can see a set that has a crown or a tiara, a necklace, and some earrings that are all done out of emerald and diamond, and they were bought by Napoleon for Josephine, I believe. I don't think it was his second wife. I think it truly was Josephine. And I remember seeing that, standing there and looking at that, and I thought, oh my gosh, who would have thought a military man like that would have had taste? Because it was stunning. And ever since then, I had a little voice in the back of my head that said maybe I should learn just a little bit more about him because he's so kind of instrumental in modern history. But my interest in history and really what I studied cuts off kind of around the time of the early Renaissance. And so this is very modern history for me. And during the pandemic, Shakespeare and Company, which is an English language bookstore there in Paris, it was really struggling. And I remember they put out a call for people to order from them online. And so I decided to do that to kind of help them out. And basically everyone I think did, and they were completely saved, which is amazing. But I decided to buy books that had to do with French history, of course, from there. And I bought a Napoleon biography. And it was that biography that sent me down this deep, dark spiral, because I think my perception of Napoleon, and probably most people's perception of Napoleon from the outside looking in, is that he is 110% a military man. And that's true. As someone who is not really into military history, I've always thought he would kind of bore me because I don't really care that much about the battles, so to speak. I enjoy having the timeline, but I'm more interested in personal dynamics. When you get into Napoleon, you learn that he was a very emotional, kind of awkward, but also really romantic individual. And he loved to read. And so to me, I kind of fell in love with him just a little bit while reading that nonfiction. And so we're definitely going to talk about that today, but that's really what I wanted to kind of introduce the video with. I've kind of tried to tell you a little bit about the figures going into these videos. I don't think Napoleon needs an introduction. I think most of us know that Napoleon was the Emperor of France and he was defeated very famously at Waterloo in 1815. But I think if your perspective of Napoleon is just that he is a tyrant, just that he is a really big military person, I want to go on and correct you. He is all of that, but he's even more. And that's kind of the side of Napoleon that I like and that I think is attractive. So that's what I'm really excited about when I think about the film. I think Joaquin Phoenix has kind of the personality to convey that awkwardness and that weirdness just a little bit. There's something about Napoleon that is just very awkward, and I really enjoy that about him. So to start off my recommendations, I do want to recommend some primary sources. So the first thing is Napoleon's letters to Josephine. I think if you know anything about Napoleon, you know about his really long love affair with a woman named Josephine. And this is one of history's kind of great love stories. Josephine was 100% not as into Napoleon as Napoleon was into her. And these letters really reflect that. As with Mary Shelley, who was living at the same time, this is an incredibly well-documented period of history, and so a lot of Napoleon's letters, not just to Josephine, survive. That's why we're able to get such a clear picture of who he was as an individual. To me, you will come away from these letters really, really liking him. I think these letters show a side of Napoleon that you honestly wouldn't expect to be there. And that's kind of the side that I like. He is a complete simp for Josephine. These letters are very sensual, very sexual, and they're very embarrassing, quite frankly. A lot of times when you read from the perspective of Napoleon, or you're reading a nonfiction about Napoleon, Josephine does not come off very well at all, basically because she really wasn't into him at the beginning. She did, I think, come to really love him in her own way later in life, but when their relationship was getting up off the ground, she 100% was not that into him. And that's always portrayed as very unfortunate on her part, and it also kind of portrays her as very cold. When you read these letters, you see her point. You know, I think we've all been there, and I think you understand Josephine's perspective when you read some of these letters, because he would have gotten on my last nerve too. And so he would send multiple letters and she would send maybe one line back. And I just think that's iconic behavior on her part. But some of these letters are so incredibly romantic. I personally really love his letters, and I think you can get so much out of them. Really, you can get more out of them than you almost can out of a modern nonfiction. And I guess that's because that's my interest as a historian and as a history lover. I want to like you. I want to know something about you. I don't necessarily care so much about what you did. And Napoleon is one of the rare cases where what he did is extraordinary, and who he was personally is also really extraordinary and fascinating and attractive. And so I think the letters really encompass everything that I'm interested in out of history. And I think they also kind of just show that Napoleon really was a regular guy. People like Napoleon or Julius Caesar, they come down to us with a certain reputation that comes across as larger than life, and you kind of file off the edges that maybe don't seem quite in line with the greatness of their historical reputation. I think it's interesting that so much has survived about Napoleon that shows him as kind of the loser, you might even say, that he really was personally, especially in love. To me, that's disarming, and it makes him more interesting, in fact, than just the great achievements. So I definitely recommend reading his letters. Some of them are so secondhand embarrassing to read, but some of them are so romantic. It is unbelievable. And so you kind of understand both sides with Josephine. Sometimes you're wondering, why does she even put up with this? Of course, she really needed help. After the French Revolution, she needed some stability, and Napoleon was there. But you do sometimes wonder, wasn't there anybody else, Josephine, if he really bothered you that much? But then sometimes the greatness shines through and you see exactly why she put up with all the other stuff. So I definitely recommend reading his letters to her. Another interesting primary source is the private memoirs of the court of Napoleon. And this was written by a guy who was moving around in Napoleon's court. His last name is Bausset-Roquefort, I think. And he is somebody who's a bit of a fly on the wall, and he is recording basically everything that goes down on the day-to-day in Napoleon's court. And this is just a really juicy piece of history, basically. He is spilling the tea here. You're really getting to listen like behind closed doors. You're hearing private conversations through this. I think this is a really important piece of nonfiction, and it's just in general a really interesting look into the time period and into the court politics, because Napoleon's court is semi the same, but also incredibly different from kind of the Bourbon court pre-revolution. And so the ways people interact with him, the ways that people kind of kowtow to him, those are very interesting. And it's also kind of different, but still reminiscent of the pre-revolution days. And that's the thing about Napoleon. Napoleon did a lot for France. Napoleon did a lot to help France recover in many ways from the French Revolution. But in other ways, he just kind of returned her back to that state prior to the revolution. And so I think this is a really interesting source that kind of lets you in on the secret of his court. And it's not necessarily from somebody who was totally pro-Napoleon. So this to me has less of a bias than reading, of course, his own writing does. You can also read stuff from the perspective of Talleyrand, and Talleyrand is a really interesting individual. And I almost wanted to include a biography of Talleyrand here because I think Talleyrand was really close to Napoleon and he's a really interesting figure, but that just skewed a little bit more Talleyrand focused than Napoleon focused. But you can read a lot of memoirs of people who were in Napoleon's court. This to me is just the most interesting, and it's also the most detailed. So this includes information about Josephine and about the fact that Josephine apparently can't bear him an heir, so Napoleon then divorces her. But as I always say when dealing with something that is a journal, there are many places where this book drags and where you're thinking, why am I even reading this? So you do have to get through some things that are a bit of a slog to get to the more interesting parts, but to me, this is well worth the read. Okay, let's get into more modern nonfiction, and let's talk about the book that inspired me to have an entire year of Napoleon, and that is Napoleon the Great by Andrew Roberts. And this book in the States is just called Napoleon. I get so many questions and comments on my old Napoleon videos about, is this book the same as that? Yes, I think he's only written one 900-page biography of Napoleon, so they are the same. But the title here is really interesting because one of the arguments that Andrew Roberts makes throughout this biography is that Napoleon should be called the Great. This is such an incredible piece of nonfiction, you would not believe it. It is so readable. And like I said, to me, the best thing about this is that it eases you into the idea of Napoleon and it makes you like him. It makes you fall in love with him a little bit before he becomes the great military genius, before he really shows off what he can do. And that to me is really the greatest thing about this. It completely disarms you and it changes your expectations and what you think of Napoleon before he ever starts to do what you know he did, what you know he is famous for. To me, that's the mark of a great biography. I want to like Napoleon the man before I get to know Napoleon the general. And that's exactly what this biography does. Of course, this biography is really incredibly long, but I think it's worth it. I think it deserved the page count. To me, the bibliography alone is incredible. Something I will say that is kind of a negative critique of this biography is that most people think this is positive to the nth degree. This is a really, really cleaned up portrait of Napoleon. And I guess that's why I like it. And I guess that's why I like Napoleon, period, is that this book kind of held my hand and introduced me to him and to his time period. But there are a lot of people who really don't like this. I personally do. A lot of people will say that Andrew Roberts is kind of too emotionally invested in this. And again, as I always say, why are you in history? Why are you a historian if you're not personally invested? History is, in the first place, to me anyway, a discipline of passion. Only people who are passionate, who are obsessive, get into this field. And so I really appreciate the way that Andrew Roberts wrote this, and definitely his dedication to Napoleon and to rehabilitating in some ways some of the negative imagery that he has in his reputation, especially regarding the argument that Napoleon should be considered the Great. I personally agree with that because there are a lot of things about Napoleon that truly do make him exceptional. This biography really goes into detail about each of those individually. And I think when you come away from this biography, you agree with him. Definitely Napoleon should be called the Great. And I think you walk away from this too with a different idea and perception of who Napoleon was personally. And that to me is really why this is the greatest biography of him. And honestly, this is one of the best pieces of nonfiction I have ever read. It is so wonderful to read. And a lot of that we can't even say is down to Andrew Roberts. A lot of it is because so much of Napoleon's own writing survives. And so a lot of this is just you reading stuff that Napoleon himself wrote down, quotes actually from Napoleon. To me, this is genuinely fascinating, and if you, like me, are not really into the military side of things, I don't think this biography spends too long on those. And when it does, it's actually really interesting and you're really fascinated to know more. I don't think much is spent really on the military campaigns. It's more on how brilliant he was in terms of structuring them. So I think this is a really good middle of the road biography. If you are someone who's a military historian and that's what you're really interested in, this may not give you all that you're looking for. There are great military histories out there about most of his campaigns, but this is really about Napoleon the man, and that's why it is so brilliant to me. Now, in conversation with Andrew Robert, we have Adam Zamoyski. His biography is my current read, and I will say it is a far more critical biography than Andrew Roberts. If you have been into Napoleon for any length of time, you've probably watched them go up against each other in their debate, which was really, really fascinating. They are both really incredible historians, and they've both done a lot of work on this time period. So to hear them discuss Napoleon at all is a real pleasure. But they really do have opposing viewpoints on Napoleon. Like I said, Andrew Robert completely believes that Napoleon should be called the Great, but Adam Zamoyski is far more critical of him. And I think these are good biographies to read in tandem, to read kind of back to back, because I do think they're offering two different perspectives on him. And these are both really modern biographies. Both have been written in the past 20 years, so they are really up to date and fresh. I'll say so far for me, this hasn't had the level of magic as the Andrew Roberts one. To me, that was just instantaneous, and I think it's because that was my intro to Napoleon. I think I always feel that with the biography that introduces me to someone, there's just something a little bit spellbinding when you get introduced to someone for the first time. And so I think that will always be a special biography to me. Now, I'm kind of an old hat, and I know a lot about Napoleon, but this to me still had such a stellar introduction. I think it's interesting, really, to write a biography of someone that you clearly have a lot of problems with. And that's definitely what this feels like. And that's interesting to me, definitely. And of course, it's true. No one's going to sit here and tell you that Napoleon was a saint. He was an absolutely terrible person in some cases. But in others, he did a lot of great things. There were a lot of great reforms that he made. And there are things that he did that are still in practice today. So I think it's interesting to kind of toe the line with him. Maybe Andrew Roberts' biography is a little bit too positive, and maybe this one you might say is a little bit too negative. I just think this one is a little bit more nuanced. I think there is more discussion of the bad that Napoleon did in a way that really condemns him for it. I think Andrew Roberts always couched criticism of Napoleon by saying he was in a rough place and he kind of had to do something. This book really says, well, did he have to do that? If you have not watched their debate, I cannot recommend it enough. It definitely does feel, though, like they're kind of spearheading Andrew Roberts in that debate, definitely. He definitely holds his own, though. But I think it goes to show that for most people, this biography is probably more unbiased and a little bit more nuanced than Andrew Roberts. But my gosh, for the money, you're just getting something really extraordinary to me with Andrew Roberts' biography. I'll be interested to see how I feel about this one when I get to the end of it, but I think it's very interesting because clearly they are both in conversation about Napoleon, and I think their books are almost in conversation a little bit, so it's interesting to kind of read them together. The last nonfiction that I want to recommend is kind of my pet interest when it comes to Napoleon, and this is called Plunder, and this is essentially about Napoleon's plunder of art from all of the various countries that he conquered in his time as emperor. And I think this is a really fantastic nonfiction. This is the most modernly published of any of those that I've recommended today. I think it came out during the bicentennial year of Napoleon's death. One thing about Napoleon is that he really liked art, and that was one thing that he was really interested in doing for the country of France, is boosting their reputation in terms of the arts. And so he had, famously, an Italian campaign, and one of the pieces that he took from Italy was Veronese's Wedding Feast at Cana, which is a massive, really wall-to-wall painting of the wedding feast at Cana from the Bible. It still hangs in the Louvre. You can see it. It's in the same room as the Mona Lisa. Most people ignore it for her, but really the wedding feast at Cana is 10 times the Mona Lisa, but I'm not a big Da Vinci fan. Napoleon stripped this off the wall in a church in Venice because he said if it was exposed to the salt air too long, it would be destroyed. He also stole the bronze horses, very famously, off of St. Mark's Cathedral there in Venice, and he took them to Paris too. Napoleon very famously said, if you were an artist, you were French. So he was interested in taking a lot of interesting art pieces from the areas that he plundered. So not just Italy, but also Egypt. He very famously had an Egyptian campaign where he took back so much. This is one of my pet interests just in general. I really am interested in the plunder of art. It is genuinely fascinating to me. And I love to look at the provenance of pieces that are in museums. And so this is really interesting because it talks about Napoleon's interest in art and also just in general how much art still remains in France that he took. It also talks about pieces that were eventually given back, but it's very interesting. And this to me is just a fascinating nonfiction. If you're into art at all, I think this is a great entry point into Napoleon because it talks a lot about what he was interested in, but it also talks about the art pieces. And it does kind of go into a broader discussion about museums and about art pieces in museums and plunder of art historically, which is genuinely fascinating to me. So I definitely wanted to recommend this. This is really only nominally about Napoleon. He features in this quite prominently, and he's kind of the thesis for the book, but he is not really the main focus of the large majority of it. It is a genuinely fascinating and page-turning read though, so I definitely wanted to recommend it. I would love to know down below if you have read any of these and if you have some Napoleon recommendations. I really have a soft spot for Napoleon. I don't necessarily want to say that he's one of my favorite historical figures, but I think he's kind of up there. There's just something about him. And so I really wanted to do this video, not just in this series, but also to kind of get prepped for the movie, to get really excited about the movie. And I am really excited. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.